Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read a lightly edited version of Pioneer Work in Opening the Medical Profession to Women, Autobiographical Sketches by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, published in 1895. The book will be read in order, so if you would like to begin at the beginning, please start with Season 2, Episode 26. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, or Facebook at Exploration Dreamland. If you would like to recommend a text, please email us at explorationdreamland, all one word, @gmail.com. You can also find our episodes on YouTube. Please subscribe or follow and review us wherever you find us. Your actions will help others find us too. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. I have had a delightful visit to Hampstead, where Dr. Wilkinson lives. He received me at once with the greatest kindness and interest, introduced me to his wife, a very sweet woman, graceful and gentle, and to some very pretty black-eyed children. He was disappointed that my stay was so short, told me I ought certainly to spend a year in London, that the longer he lived in it, the more wonderful it seemed to him, that every idea was represented there not by a single individual, but by a whole class, and that the societies I might study there would be of great service to me as a means of development. He is a tall, strong man, not handsome, wears spectacles, and has a strong expression of goodness in his face. He took me to see two people who were desirous of making my acquaintance, and showed me all the fine points of view from Hampstead, which truly is a most lovely spot, though only 2 miles from London. It is a hilly range, looking down on wide undulating country on both sides, with blue hills in the distance, Windsor Castle being distinctly visible 20 miles off. I cannot describe the place. It seems to have built itself in one of nature's choicest nooks. There is a common covered with golden gorse, broken by little dells in which pretty cottages are nestled, and there are old mansions hidden in noble parks, old walls covered with luxuriant ivy, shady lanes with long avenues of trees and smooth hedges of hawthorn and laurel, fields covered with a rich carpet, golden with buttercups and daisies, the cows quietly feeding in a veritable paradise to them. Then there are all manner of odd corners and irregular clusters of houses, but everywhere the most intense vegetation. The little cottage occupied by Byron, who used often to resort to this lovely spot, was pointed out to me, and Harrow, where he went to school. We had much interesting conversation. In the omnibus I parted from the doctor with real regret, but quite refreshed by the cordial intercourse. Journey to Paris. All my teachers and medical friends in America had strongly advised my going to Paris, as the one place where I should be able to find unlimited opportunities for study in any branch of the medical art. Being then desirous of pursuing surgery as well as medicine, I followed their advice. On May 21, 1849, with a very slender purse and few introductions of any value, I found myself in the unknown world of Paris, bent upon the one object of pursuing my studies, with no idea of the fierce political passions then smouldering amongst the people, nor with any fear of the cholera which was then threatening an epidemic. Curious glimpses of this outer world are given in letters sent home at that time. Paris, 11 Rue de Seine, May 1849. You see, dear friends, that I have reached my destination at last, and fairly established myself in this strange city. I parted from my kind companion, who in London had spent the whole week in one continued effort to aid me in every possible way, with real gratitude. I could not thank him. Words seemed too meaningless. I left London with the profoundest respect for the vast power of many kinds displayed there, and a grateful remembrance of a personal reception that had been so encouraging. It rained the whole way over. An English lady returning to Paris with her husband was very friendly. She promised to show me the best place to stay at in Calais, and said if I would travel with them in the cars, she could give me much information about Paris, for the French made a point of cheating the English unmercifully, thinking they were immensely wealthy. We were notified of our approach to Calais by a strong smell of fish. It was quite dark and raining in torrents. I was very glad to have companions. We picked our way as well as we could over the stone pier, enclosed by walls on which stood a lighthouse glaring into the dark night. We stepped into the rooms where the passports are examined, and there the whiskered faces showed me I was amongst strangers, and the "Où allez-vous, madame?" confirmed the fact. Next morning I stood for some time on the pier, waiting for the custom-house officer and watching the strange people. Market women in their white caps, the common people wear no bonnet. Groups of workmen in blue blouses, fish women of enormous muscular development, though short, returning from fishing, laden with their nets, clad in a single petticoat scarcely reaching to the knee. Little children with their schoolbooks making sundry excursions on to the fishing smacks by the way, and chattering French with all their might. At the custom-house the search was very slight. They did not even see the cases which I had put at the back of a larger trunk, and I was only charged a couple of francs. We left Calais at 9 o'clock, and the difference between France and England was apparent the whole way. The country was no flatter than between Liverpool and Birmingham, but badly drained and badly cultivated, with many peat bogs and dwarf willows bordering the watercourses. There were many villages built of light-colored stone, but apparently not one brisk, thriving town. The whole way wooden fences instead of beautiful live hedges, women digging trenches and working in the peat bogs, and the railroad left in the rough, unfinished styles of America, without the excuse of an immense young country. At the custom-house in Paris, where they searched the trunks for butter and cheese, I parted from my traveling companions and launched boldly into the sea of Paris. It looked very odd as I drove along, the streets so narrow, with such odd old-fashioned houses, all built of this light-colored stone, which has no sort of expression. They charged extravagantly at the hotel where I passed the night, so I determined at once to procure lodgings, and set off early next morning to hunt up Mr. Doherty, who I knew through Dr. Wilkinson would tell me the right quarter for medical doings. I started off with a map in my hand and hope in my heart, and reached Mr. Doherty's house very early, I suppose, for Parisian hours, for the gentleman was in bed when my letters were handed in, and soon after a short, sleepy-looking man made his appearance, with a horrid coarse beard, a blue and red woolen dressing-gown, and green baize trousers hanging about his ankles. I had some difficulty in making him comprehend that I was not Anna. At last, however, with the help of letters and my explanations, all became clear. I found him very pleasant. He breakfasted, dressed, etc., while I talked to his brother Thomas, who is a beautiful artist. Mr. D. went with me to some places he knew of. At last we found a little room with bedroom attached in a central situation and at a moderate rent. The hostess was a very pleasant-looking woman, with her own room close by, the whole suite being separated from the rest of the house. I felt, however, quite disappointed in the city. It did not seem to me handsome, gay, or elegant after London. But then, in truth, I was so busy settling my own little matters that I hardly had time to examine closely. Today I have spent in walking about the city with my hostess, chiefly for the sake of chattering with her and accustoming my ear to the strange sounds, for I find I have much to learn. I have great trouble in expressing myself with any elegance, and I cannot see the physicians until I have acquired a tolerable command of words. I shall very soon, however, be able to do so. I went out to buy a bonnet today, but found that my unfortunate organs were totally unable to squeeze themselves into a Parisian headdress, so I was obliged to order a bonnet, choosing plain grey silk, although I was assured again and again that nobody wore that colour. An interview with Lamartine. At this period much sympathy was felt in America for the Republican movement in France, of which Lamartine was the head. Before leaving Philadelphia, a friend had asked me to be the bearer of one of those expressions of sympathy from public meetings, which were then sent to the poet from all parts of the United States. I willingly undertook the commission, and now wrote to the President for permission to present the document entrusted to me. May 31, 1849. I have just returned from my visit by appointment to Lamartine, where I went to deliver the Philadelphia resolution entrusted to me. I must hasten to give you a sketch before this post, the last, closes. Of course I dressed with great care, and arrived just at the appointed hour. I was shown through several antechambers into a drawing-room, where stood the poet entertaining some visitors. He bowed, requested me to wait a few moments, and withdrew with his visitors into another room. I examined the apartment. A lofty room, carved and richly gilded, 3 long windows opening on to a balcony commanding a garden full of trees. The room contained a rich carpet and purple velvet couches and chairs, some portraits, an exquisite female profile in bas-relief, a golden chandelier from the ceiling, some antique vases, etc., and a soft green light from the trees of the large garden diffused through the room. The door opened, and Lamartine entered. Very tall and slender, but the most graceful man I have ever seen. Every movement was music, grey eyes and hair. The little bust is a pretty good likeness. He has the gentlemanly voice, Uncle Charles's, clear, melodious, perfectly well bred. In fact, his exterior harmonized perfectly with his poetry. He understood English. Slowly and distinctly, I explained the commission which had been entrusted to me. He asked me if the resolution referred to the fraternity of the race, and seemed to understand at once the whole matter when I replied in the affirmative. I referred him to the letters accompanying the resolution for full explanation respecting the document and the manner of presenting it. He said he was very happy to receive these expressions of sympathy. He would read the letters carefully and send me an answer, which I promised to transmit to America. He accompanied me very politely to the stairs, bowed, and we parted. I was in no way disappointed. There was perfect harmony in the man and his surroundings. Doubtless he is a true man, though unable to work into practice the great thoughts he cherishes. I went last night with my good little hostess to a neighboring church, where there is service every evening. It was well lighted round the central altar, but in every direction the lofty aisles stretched away into the darkness, with an occasional lamp illuminating some saint, and small groups of dark figures kneeling on the pavement. The people were assembled in the center, mostly the lower classes, women in their white caps, and little children dressed like miniature women. They knelt or stood, or sat on chairs and benches as the service required, generally with the utmost devotion. The little children used the holy water, crossed themselves, and knelt with their mothers, and regarded the bright lights, the flowers round the golden Virgin, and the impressive music with eager, wondering faces. The service was sung or chanted entirely in Latin. Occasionally a pause in the music would be broken by the sudden deep tones of a man's voice away in the darkness, or a choir of boys' voices would burst forth apparently from the clouds. The walls were covered with enormous pictures partially illuminated. I felt fully the impressiveness of this scene to the uneducated people. No thought awakened, but the emotional religious sentiment powerfully addressed, and this every night, when the solemn ceremonial contrasts so strongly and soothingly with the traffic of the day. The children are nursed in this atmosphere until it becomes a part of their nature that no reasoning can ever change. My first introduction to Paris institutions was through the visit of a public official who brought a registration paper to be filled up. I put myself down as étudiante. The man stared, and then, standing in front of me, began to make the most extraordinary grimaces, opening his eyes until the whites showed all round them. My first astonished thought was, "You ugly little brute, what on earth are you doing that for?" When, his manner suddenly changing on my look of astonishment, he tapped me benevolently on the shoulder, saying, "Mon enfant, you must not put yourself down as student. Rentier is the word you must use." In later life, with larger experience, I came to the conclusion that I had been interviewed by the police de mœurs. Fortunately, at that time I knew nothing of the corrupt system of accepting and regulating female vice. My next important interview was of a very different character. A Boston friend had procured for me, from a physician, an introduction to the famous Louis, then at the height of his reputation. It was a sealed introduction, which I forwarded with my card. The next day, a tall, imposing-looking gentleman called upon me, who proved to be Louis himself. I soon felt instinctively that his visit was one of inspection. I told him frankly of my earnest desire for hospital and practical instruction. After a long conversation, he most strongly advised me to enter La Maternité, where in one most important branch I could in a short time obtain more valuable practical knowledge than could be obtained anywhere else, and he informed me of the steps to be taken in order to obtain admission. Before leaving, however, Monsieur Louis handed to me the letter of introduction which I had sent to him, saying that he thought I ought to see it. It was an astounding production, written in such wretched French that I could only suppose that its author was unaware of its insulting character or of the effect that such a letter delivered to a French gentleman by a young unknown woman was likely to produce. I never again presented a sealed letter of introduction. Some years later, when the distinguished physician who had sent it called upon me in New York, I returned the letter to him with a few words of very serious remonstrance. On June 1, one of my sisters and a friend came to Paris, and we moved into pleasant lodgings overlooking the Luxembourg Garden. Whilst there, I attended lectures at the Collège de France and the Jardin des Plantes, and earnestly sought for admission to some of the hospitals for practical instruction. It seemed, however, that an entrance into La Maternité would be the most direct first step in obtaining the practical instruction needed, and although regretting the delay in my surgical studies which would be involved in such a course, I finally resolved to pursue the courses of that great institution. The following letters refer to this period of effort. My dear cousin, I find that I cannot enter the Maternité at present for want of an acte de naissance. I am trying to get over the difficulty, but French regulations are so strict that it is still uncertain whether I can succeed. Would it be possible to secure in Bristol a copy of my register of baptism with a statement of my birthday and my parents, certified by the mayor or some proper authority? I was baptized at Bridge Street by Mr. Lifechild. I was born on February 3, 1821. I do not know, however, whether such a register is kept in England. If it could be procured, it would remove the difficulty which lies in my way. We find Paris a very lively residence. Every day something new is occurring, or we discover some wonderful old place which we must certainly visit. One day it is the funeral celebrations of Marshal Bigot, at which all the great men assist, with an army of soldiers and an enormous crowd. Or 1,000 little girls take their first communion at St. Sulpice, dressed in white with long veils, or some grand collection of flowers or manufactured articles calls out the spectacle-loving people. There is a constant effervescence of life in this great city, which concentrates all its energy in itself and makes the Parisians at the same time the most brilliant and the most conceited people in the world. The greatest pleasure which we have yet enjoyed was our trip last Sunday to Versailles. It is really a place to be proud of, and I could not wonder at the worship which is paid to that beautiful temple by the people who, day after day, range freely through its grand galleries and spacious gardens. I received today a very pleasant letter from Dr. Webster, one of our professors at Geneva. I was much gratified to find that their course to me has been approved by the profession in America. It would have grieved me inexpressibly if they had been condemned for the aid they had given me, and there seemed to be some possibility of it when I left. But he tells me my thesis was commented on in the Report on Medicine at the National Medical Convention held in Boston, and their course in relation to me justified and approved. The thesis was received with applause. This information is quite a relief to me, for the thought would be too painful that you could injure your friends. June 15. Dear Cousin, by the 1st of July, as soon as I have conquered some miserable little difficulties, such as the acte de naissance, certificate of vaccination, etc., which I cannot produce, I shall enter La Maternité, a world-famous institution, and remain until I have succeeded in my first object, viz. To become an accomplished obstetrician. There are personal objections connected with this course that I was not prepared for. A strict imprisonment, very poor lodging and food, some rather menial services, and the loss of 3 or 4 nights' sleep every week. Still, these are things that can be borne, if the health will stand them, when the end to be gained is an important one, and I am sure you will agree with me that it is wise to sacrifice physical comfort for a while in order to attain it. I propose to remain there 3 months, and then I shall try and accomplish my second object, viz. Surgery. I hope in a day or 2 to receive permission from the Directeur Général, M. Devaine, to examine all the hospitals of Paris. I am working on gradually, but I find more clearly every day that the genius of the French nation does not suit me, and my love for the Anglo-Saxon race and my admiration for our wonderful fatherland increase by comparison. We have had a strange glimpse of a revolution, a sort of theatrical representation of what that terrible thing might be. I confess that the whole exhibition seemed to me peculiarly French, and yet there are noble and terrible passions lying below this mercurial excitability that command hearty sympathy or serious consideration, and the unjust, tyrannical acts of the government excite one's strongest indignation. Now all is quiet again, however, and the whole affair is said to have been planned by the authorities to get rid of certain troublesome men. A and E have stood the shock well, though they turned quite pale on finding as they were quietly parading the streets that they were in the midst of an émeute, and later I was sent out to see if they had not better instantly return to England before civil war broke out and their throats were cut. On the afternoon of the 13th, E and I went out to see the curious sight. The quay to the National Assembly, more than a mile long, was lined with soldiers with their drawn bayonets. The Louvre and the Tuileries opposite were closed and filled with soldiers. An army of cavalry was mounted and ready to start at any moment. We passed through hurrying crowds full of excitement, hearing fearful reports of what had happened and what was to come. On the bridges, at the corners of the streets, were large groups of blouses, students, citizens, women, listening to some orator of the moment gesticulating violently. More than once I observed a woman enthusiastically haranguing an audience. The most curious mixture of passions was visible on the faces. Fear, anger, indignation, hope, hatred. There was many a figure that realized the horrors of an earlier revolution. It seems inconceivable now that those violent expressions should have died away, and that Paris is going on in its usual busy way. June 1849. My friends, one and all, I closed my last letter apparently on the eve of a great insurrection. I went out with E.G. quickly to put it in the post, not knowing how soon we might be prisoners in the house or stirring out at the risk of life. We passed through hurrying crowds full of excitement. Through the night, heavy wagons of ammunition and provisions, escorted by soldiers, had rumbled through the streets. The public squares were shut and filled with soldiers. The democratic press was destroyed, and the next morning the city was declared in a state of siege, and a proclamation was published by the president calling on all good citizens to maintain the authority of the law. But nothing occurred. The commotion subsided, and the conservative press congratulated the country on its preservation from the dangerous conspiracy of a few seditious demagogues. It is difficult to get at the truth in a country where everybody lies upon principle, but it is now commonly believed that the whole affair was a trick of the government to get rid of Ledru-Rollin, Considerant, and other troublesome members of the Montagne, who were determined to call the president to account for his infamous conduct to the poor Romans. I do not know whether American papers give these particulars. You must tell me if I repeat what you can get better elsewhere. But we have taken deep interest in these events passing round us. Our indignation is much aroused against the conservative tyranny, and the belief in the government trick shows, curiously enough, of what it may be capable. A manifestation meeting was called to support by general feeling the attack which had been made by the advanced party in the Assembly on the unconstitutional measures of the President in suppressing popular gatherings. 200,000 men were passing quietly to the place of meeting, some of the most respectable and distinguished citizens of Paris among them, not the slightest disturbance, not even one "Vive la Constitution" was heard, but a proclamation had been stuck about the streets of the most inflammatory character, calling the citizens to arms, and signed by Considerant and Ledru-Rollin. On the strength of that proclamation, which is fully believed to have been a forgery, the meeting was dispersed and proceedings instituted against the members. The government is proceeding with a high hand. I see that today even the conservative press is putting in a feeble protest. You would be amused to see how universally politics are discussed. The boy who arranged our rooms, the market women at their stalls, everyone finds time to read a journal and give some opinion about it. On June 30, I entered La Maternité. My residence there was an invaluable one at that stage of the medical campaign when no hospitals, dispensaries, or practical clinics were open to women. La Maternité was the great state institution where young women to be trained as midwives were sent up from every department of France. The system of instruction, both theoretical and practical, was a remarkable illustration of that genius for organization which belongs to the French. Every moment of time was appropriated. No distraction of books, newspapers, or other than medical works were allowed. Lectures, ward work, drills, and clinics were arranged from morning to night with no confusion, but no pause, and the comprehension and progress of each pupil was constantly tested by examination. The institution occupied the old convent of Port Royal, and the discipline was monastic in simplicity, regularity, and seclusion. Stirring events were occurring in Paris during my residence in the Maternité, but only vague rumors reached us, as no newspapers were allowed within the old grey convent walls. The following letters give curious pictures of life in this remarkable French institution. July 1, 1849. À la Maternité. Dear Mother, I have now entered upon a strange phase of life, which I must try and describe, that you may imagine me running about in my great white apron, in which respectable article of apparel I expect to figure for the next 3 months. I had a good many obstacles to encounter from my ignorance of French customs, and the physicians of Paris, as far as I can judge, are determined not to grant the slightest favor to a feminine M.D. I could not obtain from any persons connected with the Maternité the smallest modification to suit the very different status with which I enter from the young French sage-femme, but I was determined to enter on whatever conditions, and enter, too, by the 1st of July, to habituate myself a little to the ways of the place before the annual lectures commenced. I find now that nothing would have been easier than to have given me a little room to myself, permission to go out occasionally, and similar favors, which need have occasioned no jealousy or inconvenience, for the very fact of my being a foreigner impresses the French girls, and they would freely have accepted any claim made for me. But everything was obstinately refused to all the representations of myself or the consul, Mr. Walsh, and I was only too glad to enter as a young ignorant French girl. On June 30, I drove down with Anna to the hospital. A high stone wall, with the tops of old buildings peeping above, extends nearly the whole length of a little street. A very small door led into a dark little entrance, the portiere on one side, and a long room, called by courtesy the parloir, on the other. You must notice the parloir, for it is there I shall receive my visitors, if I ever have any, at 2 o'clock, in common with the other élèves. And there in one corner, in a sort of little glass box, sits the good dame who attends to the letters and transacts all the outdoor business for the élèves. The ceiling is very low, the floor of brick, rows of wooden benches ranged one before the other, the most uninteresting room you can possibly conceive, the only pretty thing being the vine leaves which peep through the diamond-shaped windows. This room forms part of a row of old buildings standing against the wall, which contain the director's bureau, the internes' rooms, etc. It was too late for me to see Monsieur Boivin, the director, so an old woman took me into the central buildings, through a labyrinth of little passages and long galleries, and all manner of rooms and queer places, to Madame Charrier, the sage-femme-in-chief, who has her own rooms in a particular part of the building. Her parlor is the funniest little cabinet of curiosities, with a carpet on the floor, as it is brick instead of waxed wood. Little chintz sofas, mosaic tables, boxes, china and figures, crucifixes, pictures and embroideries, and curtains everywhere. Madame Charrier is a little deformed woman, elderly, but with a fresh color still and kind blue eyes. I like what I have seen of her. She seems generally loved by the pupils, and though I do not imagine her of any particular amount of intellect, she seems to have good sense, and after 12 years in such an establishment as this, she ought to have much valuable experience. Madame Charrier conducted me by unknown ways to Madame Blackwell, the superintendent of the dortoirs, who took me into the infirmary, and said I must sleep there until I had arranged my affairs with the director. I did not much admire the idea of passing the night in the infirmary. There was a large wood fire on the hearth, and the air felt warm and somewhat close. I looked suspiciously at the long rows of beds extending on each side, their white curtains closely drawn. I did not know what undesirable emanations might be proceeding from them. However, I said nothing, but determined to investigate the contents of the beds as soon as the observers had withdrawn. My trunk was brought up, my bed pointed out, a little lamp placed on the table, and I was left alone. I proceeded then to make my observations, and found to my great relief that every bed was empty except one, in which one of the élèves, who happened to have a headache, was lying, and from her I found that the place is healthy and no epidemic has prevailed there for a long time. I found her, like all the other French girls, full of those light kindnesses which are so pleasant. She asked me eagerly if I was from her province, and seemed to regard me with much interest when she found I was a stranger from New York, which was the only part of the United States she had heard of, and which she took to be an island near Havana. I have since found that the pupils are much disappointed that I am not black, as they supposed all persons from America were. After talking a little with her, I took out my writing materials and sat down to the table, determining to pay a little visit across the water before going to rest in my new home. But I had no sooner seated myself than Madame Charrier entered with a crowd of élèves to know if I would pass the night in the salle d'accouchement, it being an optional matter the first night. Of course, I expressed the utmost willingness. I put up my letter with a sigh, dressed myself for duty, and accompanied an ancienne élève, that is, one who has already studied a year, and who always has one or more of the nouvelles élèves under her care for initiation, to the room where the children are born. A large apron of coarse toweling was given me, with the injunction not to lose it, or I should have to pay 3 francs. It was a large upper room, rather dimly lighted, beds all round, a fire on the hearth, cupboards full of linen in the corners, heaps of shining copper and tin utensils, several rush-bottomed chairs and wooden tables, and in the center a large wooden stand with sides, on which the little newcomers, tightly swathed and ticketed, are ranged side by side. In the course of the night we had the pleasure of arranging 8 in this way, and the next morning, when Madame Charrier made her appearance, the cloth was removed and the sight shone with much triumph. It was really very droll. Each little shapeless red visage peeped from under a coarse peaked cap, on the front of which was a large label with the name and sex. A black serge jacket with a white handkerchief pinned across, and a small blanket tightly folded round the rest of the body completed the appearance of the little mummy. Their behavior certainly realized Fourier's supposition, for there was very little crying all the time they lay there together. There were 4 young French girls sitting up with me, besides the girl who makes the beds and does the roughest work. They were all pretty and pleasant, of no education except their studies in the institution, but those had been evidently carefully attended to, and it sounded not a little droll to hear the scientific terms flowing so glibly from their laughing lips, which were busily employed in talking nonsense all the time that their duties did not call them to the bedside. The next morning, at 10 o'clock, we were discharged from duty. It was Sunday, a comparatively leisure day, and I, being a Protestant, was excused from the religious services. But I was too sleepy to do much. I wrote, walked in the garden, and read a little there, retired early, and had a most welcome sleep and very pleasant dreams. Our dortoir is a large airy room, with a row of windows and beds on each side, divided into two by a large archway. It contains 16 beds, occupied mostly by anciens élèves. I have a window behind my bed. I have shoved the bed forward, fitted in a chair behind, hung up my dressing gown, and put a few books on the floor by my side, and call it my room. I am now sitting there writing to you. I have just room enough to move my right arm freely, but I am out of the way. I am breathing fresh air, so I consider myself very well off. An old crucifix ornamented by gilded leaves hangs at one end of the dortoir. 2 little lamps are suspended from the ceiling. An iron bedstead and a chair are appropriated to each individual. The floor is formed of little hexagon bricks, which in some of the rooms are so terribly polished that I walk on them with difficulty. The dortoir is seldom quiet. The girls sit there a good deal, and some who have watched through the night are generally there in bed. And how French girls do chatter! How they do go into sudden fits of ecstasy or rage! Once at least in the day we have a grand storm, Madame Blackwell coming in for some trouble or other, in which she and the accused outscream each other and appear to be mortal enemies for a few minutes, and the best of friends immediately after. At 12 o'clock we receive our supply of bread for the day, which we keep in our bedroom and take backwards and forwards to meals. I have frequently wished that you could see me walking gravely along the gallery with my loaf of bread wrapped in a napkin under my arm. The dining room is a large hall full of round tables, only 3 of which are occupied at present, as the élèves only number 30 instead of 90, the usual number. At dinner I saw them all together for the first time, some very pretty and graceful, some very rough. I am learning to take wine. Everyone advises me to do so, and I shall soon be able to drink my bottle a day. There seems to be an admirable organization of work here in every department. I have been much amused today by the lessons in theory that I have received from my ancien élève or chef. The pupils all sat round, and the young instructress, furnished with some bones, gave out an explanatory sentence, which was repeated by each one in turn. I found it an excellent plan of learning French. Of course, the repetition would have been intolerable without the language, but to listen to a dozen different voices and to repeat myself I found to be an admirable practice. Indeed, being cut off from all English communication is a great advantage in learning French. July 3. This morning I finish my letter in another situation. I wrote last night till it was dark, and the little lamp in our dortoir gave so much darkness that I went to bed for want of light. Today I am en service, that is to say, I shall spend the day from 8 in the morning till 8 in the evening in superintending the 6 rooms of the infirmary. I have been handling leeches for the first time, disgusting little things. I enter with an ancien élève who shows me all the ways of the house. At present the lectures have not commenced, but the visits of Madame Charrier and the physician take place every day, and nature is always here in great abundance to be studied. I feel I shall gain a great deal, and hitherto it has really not proved nearly so formidable an imprisonment as I supposed. The air is delightful this beautiful summer weather, the girls pleasant. There is much to interest in so large an establishment, and I suppose the 3 months will soon slip away, for I have entered, in my own mind, only for the 3 months, though I have been asked so often if I am going to stay 2 years that I have had to tell a great many evasions. I shall have, doubtless, many weary moments, but I want you all to know that it will not be so utterly miserable as my former letters may have represented it, and great will be the reward. So send a welcome greeting to the voluntary prisoner. July 1849. Dear M, I last wrote to you when I was my own mistress. Now in some measure I have given up my liberty, and I must give you a little sketch of my prison life, that you may be able to picture the surroundings of your sister M.D. Imagine a large square of old buildings, formerly a convent, set down in the center of a great court with a wood and garden behind, and many little separate buildings all around, the whole enclosed by very high walls, over the tops of which, shining out beautifully against the clear sky, may be seen the dome of the Pantheon, the Hôtel des Invalides, and the whole building of the observatory which is close adjoining. The inner court is surrounded by Les Cloîtres, a most convenient arched passage which gives a covered communication to the whole building, and which I suppose was formerly traversed by shaven monks on their way to the church, whose great painted window looks out into the court, but which now echoes the laughter of many merry girls, and across which, at 7:30 every morning, you may see your humble servant, with her coarse tablier de service and little white pot in hand, hurrying to get some coffee. At 5:30 every morning I start up in bed, roused by the bustle of the élèves who are up before me. I make violent efforts to drive away sleep, which are only partially successful, and then follow the example of 20 girls who inhabit the same long dortoir, and who are busy each by her own iron bedstead dressing hastily to be ready for the visit. I hasten upstairs to the long corridor, the Sainte Elizabeth, where my patients lie. I inquire carefully their condition, wash them, and see that the beds have been properly arranged. By that time it is 6:15. Madame Charrier makes her appearance and goes the rounds, accompanied by the élèves, each one giving a short report of the patients under her care. It is a funny group, 50 women or more of all ages, wide awake from the hurry of their duties, but dressed mostly in haste with little white caps, colored handkerchiefs, and the coarser ones in short bedgowns, their faces browned by the sun, their hands red with hard work, but all good-tempered, with a kind word always ready, and their black eyes sparkling with life. We pass through the Salle Sainte-Marguerite, Sainte Elizabeth, Sainte Anne, visiting each patient in her alcove. It is 7 when we finish. I hasten back to my dortoir, make my bed, etc., fetch my coffee, which I procure for 2 sous a morning from the superintendent of the infirmary, eat it hastily with my bread, which is always supplied for the day at noon, and then hurry off to the Salles Sainte-Marie and Sainte-Marthe, where the more sick patients are placed, whom the attending physicians visit every morning at 8. At this visit are present Monsieur Girardin, the chief physician, a tall, dry, gray-haired man, full of pomposity, the interne, Monsieur Blot, a very handsome, somewhat dignified young physician with, I fancy, rather a cross temper, Madame Charrier, the aide-sage-femme, and as many of the élèves as choose to be present. This over, I make some independent visits to cases which interest me, to the nursery, etc., and try to pick up a little here and there. Then I return to the dortoir and read or write a little. Afterwards I join the class instruction in the wood, a preparatory lesson which the elder élèves give to the younger ones, and which I attend for the sake of the French. It is a very pretty method of instruction, the young teacher seated on the grass, all the pupils grouped around under the thick shade of some fine tree, the atmosphere being of an elastic purity which is truly charming. The French girls have a natural talent for instruction. They are so in the habit of talking that they never find the slightest difficulty in expressing what they know, and their lively perceptions give them a peculiar power for superficial instruction. Our poor country girls find it very hard at first to catch scientific words that they do not understand, but in a surprisingly short time they roll them off smoothly and to a certain extent understand well what is taught them. Stay tuned for the next segment from Pioneer Work in Opening the Medical Profession to Women by Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find this and many other interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.